Books, hosting the Or Books podcast. We're here with Or's latest author, David Griscom, who wrote The Myth of Red Texas, out now. David, it's so great to have you here. Thanks for coming.
I'm really thrilled to be here.
Great. So we're discussing this book that's about the history of the left and radicalism in Texas, starting from over several hundred years. David, could you talk about the process of shaping this book and how you came to write this?
Yeah, I mean, really, so probably not a surprise to anybody, but I'm a Texan, so I've always been very interested in Texas history. I'm also a socialist, so I've always wanted to find ways to connect and understand the history and the place that I love so much with politics based around democracy and liberation. And when it came to this book, really, I think the genesis of it is something that we'll probably get into in a little bit, but it's the story about the fence cutters, which was a story that I came across just reading a lot of kind of Texas history blogs and Texas history pieces, and that story was always kind of presented and talked about it as a way of how law and order came to the state of Texas, when in fact you look at the story, it is very much a story of working class people organizing together to fight back against private property and the capitalist class. So once I started doing my own research into that story, I started to kind of look a little bit deeper into this major process in Texas history as it was really becoming itself as a state. And what I found was just kind of endless, and it really inspired me to go deeper and to eventually write this book.
For the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you give a brief background of the fence cutters and who they were and what kinds of fences they were cutting?
No, totally. Texas at this period of time, and we're talking mainly in like the 1870s, so this is after the Civil War, and the state is kind of going through the aftermath of the Civil War. Texas wasn't as devastated as other states in the South from the Civil War, but they didn't have like physical money, but they did have a lot of land. There's a tremendous interest from Northern and British investors in this new capitalist class to start investing into the state of Texas. They start buying up tremendous amounts of land, and this so happens to coincide with the invention of this strange new wire, which we now know as barbed wire, that really overtook the state very quickly, because for a long time there was an actual physical limit on how much land you could claim for yourself, right? If you have to build a fence out of rock, there's only so many rocks that you can pull from the ground, and particularly in West Texas and in the Panhandle, access to those kind of materials were very limited. So you see this massive bonanza of this new class of people who had been buying up tracts of land and fencing, enclosing large parts of the state. And they didn't just cover up their land, they also covered up access to streams, covered up the grasslands. And in Texas, there's always this idea of something called the open range. People probably heard it in folk songs and things like that. But it was an understanding that the land in general does belong to the people. So they built up this entire swath maze of barbed wire, and it prevents particularly small landholders and also landless cowboys from being able to raise cattle, because you physically couldn't get cattle from place to place. So this entire tradition of cowboying, that when we think of like that romantic and mythical version of Texas cowboying, it dies because of barbed wire. So these poor farmers and these landless cowboys start to get together and they start cutting these fences. At first, just as a practical measure, because you need to get access to water, you need to move your cattle, but it very quickly became a political movement. And a lot of these cowboys were cutting fences not just because they had to move their cattle somewhere, but because they opposed the idea of enclosing upon the commons. And this wasn't a small isolated event. This happened all across the state. And eventually large landowners started to hire goons and thugs to protect their fences. And what happened is what's known as the Texas Fence Cutting War.
There was like an amazing quote in the book, I think, that some of the fence cutters referred to the wire as like devil's wire or something?
Devil's rope, yes.
Devil's rope,
yeah.
Okay. But interesting that that kind of technology enabled this whole privatization of the land.
100%. And I mean, in barbed wire, I mean, it has forever changed ranching in the West, certainly, but it also has become a tool for all kinds of horrors the globe over. And yeah, it really was a moment where, this new technological innovation really allowed a kind of unnatural land ownership system that these people were fighting against.
The Cowboys, so before the barbed wire, would the Cowboys be like contracted by ranchers and then,
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of both, but some people would also have like their own herd. So some people would work as a cowboy, and the idea would be that like you would start to maybe develop your own herd on the side. And this is something that as barbed wire develops, you start to see the shift away from that older kind of free version of cowboying in Texas and something that becomes much more of wage labor. And this is something that was also very much resisted.
You touch on this also in the book. It was interesting to focus on like a history of the left and like socialism or that kind of organizing when traditionally, at least from New York, like you think of that as a really industrial movement that's like based out of the factories, you know? But yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, I think this, and this is something that is a kind of interesting aspect of the book. I mean, this probably is the only book of Texas history that has a long section of Karl Kautsky. And it was because for a long time in the socialist movement, they didn't really respect or understand what was happening in the South. And it's very similar today. When the populist movement, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, like really starts to explode, some of the socialists, particularly in New York and in Europe, are saying, oh, well, this is interesting, but these aren't industrial workers. These aren't proletariat. So for a long time, kind of theoretically, these kind of workers were excluded. And, you know, not to get too in the weeds of that kind of, you know, theoretical debate, but the fact of the matter is that the work that was happening in agriculture in Texas at this time and all across the South really does become more and more proletarianized over time. And especially when you get into like the Great Depression and this period of time, I mean, for the most part, it is like a very industrial version of agriculture that starts to dominate the state.
I want to move back a bit or step back a bit and ask you about why is it important to look at Texas? In politics today, we talk a lot about swing states and swing voters, and Texas is kind of viewed as this like solidly red state that's like not really worth getting into. So why Texas?
Well, I mean, I think most critically, I mean, Texas is one of the largest states in the country. In many ways, like this is a state that is really writing this next chapter of American history, not just Texas history. This is a place where if you're an immigrant coming to the United States of America, it's more likely that you're coming to Houston than to New York right now. So this is a place where something is going to have to happen if we want to win a better world for working class people. And pushing back against this idea that Texas is an automatically conservative state, I think is really critical. Because the right in Texas has done a very good job at trying to maintain this idea of Texas's history and of like Texanness. One of the things that I kind of talked about a little bit in the book is that our state government right now is waging war on the president of the Alamo. Right, people who are trying to do programs at the Alamo that talk about indigenous people or Hispanics in Texas. They are trying to prevent them from doing that. And why is the government of a major state at one of the largest economies in the world so fixated on making sure that our myths and our stories are seen in a certain way? It's because they understand that this is critical to a lot of their power. Because in politics, the Republican Party hasn't really provided very much for working people. Texas is a state that, despite being a major economy, it is right there at the top of the list for all of these kind of horrific poverty indicators. Women who are dying in childbirth, childhood poverty, lack of access to health care. These are things that Texas is up there at the top, despite the fact that there's a lot of money in the state. So this whole kind of Republican miracle that they talk about in Texas has been great for people like Elon Musk. It has been great for the oil billionaires, but it's been really bad for working folks. So, being able to have a story that allows us to understand ourselves as Texans and root ourselves in a longer tradition is important, because the right doesn't rely so much on what it is that they've done for everyday people. They rely very much on this kind of cultural understanding that to be a Texan is to be on the right and it's to be conservative.
There were so many parallels between the history that you were writing and today's politics, and especially thinking about how the Republican Party, as you said, will use cultural scapegoats to kind of strengthen their support or make a case for it. In the chapter about the early socialists, the Democratic Party at the time would also use especially race and racism and xenophobia as a way to kind of try to drive a wedge between politics like that.
No, I mean in Texas, this is a period of time when they really start ramping up restrictions on the right to vote for black people in Texas. This was a little bit after it had happened in other southern states. And it was a direct reaction to these kind of alliances between working class black people and working class whites. And that alliance was not necessarily like perfect, but it was something that was very, very frightening to those in power. And it was very effective for them to use, white supremacy to restrict access to the right to vote, because they knew that they weren't in the majority. And the only way that they could kind of maintain their power was to suppress democracy in the state of Texas. And it totally rhymes with what we're seeing today. And you see so much of how we understand like Southern politics and Southern history in the 20th century. It really is a reaction to this kind of really radical democratic promise that we saw at the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm. Coming from the outside, like Democratic parties, but also it was quite sobering that like even within the populist party and movement and the socialist movement, there was they would really enforce like Jim Crow and like segregation, and I think banned black people or black farmers from being members of some of those early movements.
So for example, like the Farmers Alliance, which was like a kind of, let's call it like a proto-union for farm workers and agricultural workers, they had different chapters. And some of this was voluntary and encouraged. There's plenty of racists within it. Some of it was just kind of abiding by the norms of the time. But I think this is really one of the great failures of both the Socialist Party and the Populist Party. Both of them had moments where it seemed like they were kind of breaking through. There might be an opportunity to break through the kind of racial terror, the racial ideology of their time. But both, at the end of the day, are unable to kind of overcome that final hurdle of like capitalist power, organized power in the state of Texas, because of this like underlying racial division, which there's a lot to be inspired from, because it is interesting to see how people in a very dangerous time kind of are breaking these norms. But it's also very tragic at the same time, because you can see the building blocks for a total victory of a different kind of politics in the state, and you see that kind of old monster of racism rear its ugly head again. And it reminds me, though, it's interesting when you read this kind of history to remember that people recognize how absurd and wrong this was at the time. Covington Hall, who was like a really great socialist leader, he spent a lot of time in Texas, but he was mainly based out of Louisiana, would write, and there's some quotes in the book from his writing, just endlessly about how stupid this kind of white supremacist ideology within these working class movements were, and how effective it was at kind of preventing working class solidarity. You see that from the socialists who are recognizing that it was harming them. You also see it from the bosses. There's some sections in the book where I talk about large landowners talking about how they are literally pitting whites and blacks against each other, and how effective that is at pushing down wages, making sure that people don't demand too much. So the ruling class also understood what they were deploying as well. And I think that sometimes when we talk about racism in this country or in the South, we forget that this was very much a purposeful system that was designed to maintain power for a certain ruling elite.
Mm-hmm. A word that came up repeatedly in the book was outsider, and how the kind of accusation of outside agitators was applied to cowboy organizers, but also the pecan farmers. But then the flip side of that is that a lot of these like large landholders, like the investments came from Northerners or Europeans.
100%.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. It's something to note. Is that this is the thing, is that in the United States, we're sitting here in the financial capital of this country, and pretty much every business throughout this country is having at least some kind of outflows or relationships to New York. It was totally the same thing back at this time as well. And it is funny to kind of note in the newspapers and like the attacks against the socialists and the populists and the cowboy strikers, the people who are actually from there, by the way, are being told that, they're outsiders, and yet the bosses, who are literally people who might have just come there in the past 25 years, get to pretend and act about themselves as Texans. And hell, this is the same thing that we see today in Texas. Like when we run, Democratic Socialist candidates, despite them being from there, being part of the community, it's always treated as a force from the outside, which was a big reason, a big part of this book for me, was wanting to show us hey, that's always been nonsense, first of all. And in fact, we probably have a deeper rooted tradition than a lot of the people who are making those accusations against us.
You also make the point that a lot of Texas has been getting progressively redder, and a lot of that is because of people moving to Texas.
Yes, yeah. No, I think that's it's a totally fascinating point. And look, I'm not somebody who wants to kind of pull up the drawbridge. I love people coming to Texas, and one of the things that I really love about Texas as a place, as a culture, is it has always been a very welcoming place. And to be a Texan isn't necessarily about blood or where you were born. It's an attitude. It's a way that you relate to this place and this culture. But it is very funny to see the political force in that state being something that has very much been cultivated by the outside. So Texas, most people know, was, like most southern states, was Democrat for most of its history, but there was a slow shift over to the Republican Party. Part of that was conservative Democrats kind of being pushed out into the Republican Party or willingly joining the Republican Party. But another aspect that ended up being critical was the fact that Texas saw a large amount of corporate relocation into the state in the 80s and 90s. And they were bringing people from the Midwest, they were bringing in people from New York, and they were bringing people from California who were traditional Republican voters. So what ended up happening was you had this new group of Texans who were Republicans and really made that party a kind of viable political party. So in many ways, like, this Republican Party, which again claims itself to be like the genuine representative of Texan history and Texas politics, was a product of mass migration, internal migration into the United States.
Yeah, it's so interesting how this idea of like authentic identity and like who really belongs to a place, which is the same. I mean, people talk about New Yorkers all the time too. That is never really something that has ever existed. Like, there's always migration and change and
100%. That's a large part of Texas's history. I mean, Texas is a confluence of a lot of different cultures. Mexico, the South. Texas had a tremendous amount of migration, obviously, at the Civil War, and also Midwest migration. And this is before even like the kind of recent pull. And I mean, and now Texas is a place that we have people from all over the planet here. And I think, Texas is no longer a majority white state. It hasn't been that for a very long time. On one hand, you've seen Democrats who have sort of expected that a diversifying state would mean that they would start to win, which hasn't really panned out, and we can maybe get into why in a little bit. But you also see this anxiety, certainly from the Republican Party, about this change and shift in demographics.
You touched on the Mexican-American or Mexican migrant community in Texas, and the third chapter of the book is about the pecan farmers in the South, and specifically a socialist, or I don't know if she identified as socialist.
Yes, she did.
Organizer named Emma Tenayuca. Can you talk about what was happening with the pecan farmers? Yeah,
I mean, this is a really fascinating story. It's one of the largest strikes in the country's history. But in Texas, in San Antonio, the pecan shellers were predominantly women, predominantly Hispanic, and they were working under just brutal and horrendous conditions. I mean, obviously, everyone can assume they're being paid, extremely low wage, but the conditions were also extremely dangerous because when you're breaking up and shelling pecans, that dust gets into the air. These were places that didn't have good ventilation, so people were having very serious respiratory issues. It was also one of those kind of economic systems that was highly exploitative. They weren't working at like one factory necessarily. Sometimes people would do the work at home. Sometimes they would kind of be shopped out into like small areas. But it was a kind of somewhere between like a formal and informal employment system. But this was big business, right? This is massive business in San Antonio. Texas produces, the vast majority of pecans in the country. So these were workers who were oftentimes had been ignored by the political establishment in San Antonio, and certainly by the political establishment in Texas, as kind of, not really a part of the state, not really worth standing up for or protecting. So what Emma Tenayuca, who was extremely young, when she led this strike, did was she organized the kind of forgotten, the ignored people in the state, and it was a massive, tremendous strike that really struck fear into the ruling elite in Texas because it represented a mobilization of people who they thought were never going to be a threat or that they could exploit as much as they wanted to.
Talk about the process of the strike and how it kind of what came out of it or how it concluded.
One of the major aspects of the strike was these large walkouts, and all across the city of San Antonio there were massive walkouts organized by Emma Tenayuca. who eventually kind of takes a step back because there was a lot of focus on her. And this is why I find her to be such a fascinating and incredible organizer. In many ways, she's like the face of the strike. She was critical to it. But there's so much attention on her as an individual, particularly because of her socialist leanings and things like that, that she ends up kind of taking a step back to let other kind of union organizers and leaders kind of take home and help out with this strike. So there's this massive walkout, and people are being attacked by the police, they're being spied on, there's all of these kind of attempts to break the strike, and yet there was just a tremendous amount of solidarity from the people in the community. And they're able to get some victories, but unfortunately over time, it was one of those kind of fights that is kind of quintessential in Texas and kind of Southern labor history, is that these fights end up at a certain part being against changes in how things are produced, right? This kind of heavy, intensive labor, the threat is that they'll kind of replace that with machines.
You talk a lot about her kind of practice of socialism, and how she thought of like cultivating like the leftist, practice as a real practice of like reading and teaching and discussing. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, Emma Tenayuka, she's an interesting character in the book too, because one of the reasons I focus on the story, because it's really one of the last major chapters in terms of like the historical aspect of the book. And I wanted to include it because there is a direct line from Emma Tenayuka to the early socialist and populist tradition. When she was young, she would hear these socialist radicals come and speak in public parks in San Antonio. So these were the veterans of the Socialist Party and the socialist movement in Texas that she's then kind of learning from when she's a young woman. She's inspired by it, and there's a direct line that goes through her, because again, the thing is with Tenayuka and many of these stories is that they don't end up winning, and this movement that she kind of builds, it has a lot of importance and it has a lot of influence, particularly in the labor movement, particularly in the rights for equal rights for Hispanic people in Texas. But that kind of tradition, that political tradition of like an alternative political movement, political party, it starts to dwindle after Tenayuka. So she comes out of this tradition, and yes, she took political education extremely seriously. She's known as the passionate one. That's her nickname. And yet, if you read, she did a really great interview later in her life with the Texas Observer, and I wouldn't say it's boring, but it's very like understated, her language. She had that kind of real practical mindset of an organizer who was always looking at what I can do for the class versus kind of focusing on yourself. In many ways, like, she continues to be such an inspiration for people in San Antonio because she did represent somebody who was really kind of class-rooted and community-oriented.
And when you say the veterans of the socialist movement, you also make the point that socialism in Texas didn't kind of die down because of like electoral changes. It was really like suppressed by 100%. The government. And
yeah, no, I mean, so there's a period of time, the socialists weren't as electorally successful as the populists were, but they were continuing to kind of make inroads and gains, and particularly they're organizing outside of just electoral work, organizing renters unions and things like that in the state, were continuing to have tremendous success. Two major things happened, though. The Mexican Revolution, which was something that was very frightening to the ruling class in Texas. The Texan socialists started to build out relationships with some of the Mexican revolutionaries. The Rebel, which was the socialist newspaper, would like reprint pieces from some of the radical Mexican newspapers in English in their paper, and vice versa. But as time goes on, you start to see this worry and this crackdown and this continued surveillance on the Texas socialists. They also have a position against involvement in World War I. And this is what ends up destroying the socialist movement, right? They took the position against, no war but class war, and they were vilified for it for sure. And this is at a time of like total jingoism in Texas. You had German towns. Texas has a massive German population, changing the names, German names of towns to things like Old Glory and things like that. And a lot of these towns in Texas, you'll find that where they started to change the names to kind of rid this German influence. And the socialists were seen as, because there were many Germans within the movement, as kind of extensions of that Germanness. But what ends up really killing the Texas Socialist Party was what was its strength. And its strength was that it was very decentralized as an organization, and the primary place of contact and organization for it was the newspaper, The Rebel. You need to have a newspaper like The Rebel in a state that is as big as Texas because it's huge, there's people all over the state. So to be able to have chapters, organization in far west Texas and east Texas and have a place for them to communicate, you have to have this newspaper. And The Rebel was the first newspaper that was shut down by the government during World War I.
We'll definitely come back to The Rebel, but to go back to Emma Tenayuka's kind of approach to organizing and socialism, you make the connection between like her really practical work of working with people, and I think you kind of describe it as class rooted instead of class focused, which you said a lot of like socialists at the time were kind of more discussing class instead of really coming from class. Can you talk about that?
No, I mean, Emma Tenayuka, she was trying to find a way to engage in a working class politics at the time at a moment where the kind of party apparatus for both like the Socialist Party had kind of fallen apart, and she had questions about the Communist Party. She does end up joining the Communist Party and was a member of the Communist Party during this period of time, though she was never really interested in some of the more revisionist positions that were happening within the Communist Party. She only actually is a member of it for a few years. I don't say this to deny her connection to it, but more so to focus on the fact that she was trying to find vehicles of working class politics that had viability, and she found that much more kind of in the streets, organizing people through the pecan sheller strike and she also worked on the cigar roller strike as well, but in that kind of way of meeting the needs of people in her community. And like the difference between class-rooted and class-focused politics is that, class-focused politics is when you talk a lot about the working class and like we want working class people to have this and have that, versus the class-rooted politics where it's like the leadership, the understanding of these movements is actually coming out of larger bodies of working class people, which Emma Tenayuka was a part of. So when I say that she was class rooted, it's because she was living that life. Like when she understood what are the needs for working class people, well, she was thinking, what are my needs, right? Because she was an extension of that kind of movement. And that was something that I think for her was very different than some of the Socialist Party meetings that she went to when she was young. She started going to Socialist Party meetings and they were like debating about Trotsky and Stalin and all this other kind of stuff that she just felt was so far away from her pressing everyday needs.
Mm-hmm. You talked about her descriptions of socialism as something that needs to be really built, and that you can't just. That I think a lot of like Marxists at the time were waiting for things to get so bad that the working classes just rebel, and that also had me thinking of your mentions of like the current Democratic Party in Texas and thinking of this demographics as destiny approach that you're just. Or what is that? What is it?
Yeah, no, I mean, so there's a few cliches in Texas politics. People will say Texas is not a red state, it's a non-voting state, and the other one was demographics as destiny. And the idea with demographics as destiny was that as the population, as Anglos ceased to be the majority population in the state, that the Democratic Party would kind of rise and reap the benefits of a changing demographics. The problem has been, it really is based on a kind of racial essentialist understanding of politics. And what we saw, unfortunately, in 2024 was that Hispanics in Texas and black people in Texas, there's enough of them who are willing to vote for Republicans. So this idea, this dream that demographic changes were going to kind of deliver victory for the Democratic Party in Texas was not just dashed. I mean, it was shown as a complete fraud because what has ended up happening is the Republicans have made gains. Now, I don't think that that's permanent, but it shows this kind of passive politics that you get with the Democratic Party, because if you're just kind of waiting for something to happen in society and the makeup of people, you're not really actually engaged in doing politics of like meeting people where they're at, asking them what their needs are, trying to deliver on them and trying to organize them. You're just hoping that you can, reap the benefits of some miracle from God. And it's been a total disaster for the Democratic Party. It's been a decades-long process of them kind of talking about this date when the demographic shift was going to occur, and it ended up being a total disaster for them and wasted decades of building an opposition.
Yeah, it's such an interesting sort of lesson in maybe how not to do politics.
So no, I mean, if you can have a master's course on how not to do politics from the Texas Democratic Party for sure.
You mentioned the Rebel, and I've been thinking about how we're in this moment where kind of local identity is somewhat dissolving, where you have the internet is kind of creating these monocultures.
But at the same time, we're becoming kind of more geographically polarized as people are moving to states that, or to cities that already align with their politics. And then you've also talked about how some of the success of socialism in Texas was, or populism as well, was that it was both decentralized and really local. But then you also had this newspaper that united the whole state. So can you talk about that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the lessons that I think is most interesting for me from this history. Because yeah, the Rebel I think is a very fascinating example about it because it was such a purposeful publication with the Southern Mercury, which was one of the main populist newspapers as well. It's also a kind of fascinating story, and like it's interesting to kind of read through these papers because they were about things that people cared about and were interested in. But they also treated their reader very seriously in a way that I think sometimes in media and even on left-wing media we don't. Not to kind of traffic in cliches or anything here, but like, I'm sorry, if you imagine what working class and populist and socialist in Texas level of literacy was then versus now, the idea that like those people could understand it, but for some reason we can't kind of have serious conversations within our own media, I think is kind of ridiculous. And what ended up happening with these papers is they became, a sense of community, a sense of organization, and they also, I think, one of the things I've been talking to with a lot of people when people read the book and you read some of the excerpts from the Rebel, there is this kind of urgency to everything that's in it. And even though these are things that were written over 100 years ago, like I'm like, damn, I feel like we're about to do something here, right? They really had a lot of spirit and energy, and you need that in a movement when you're up against extremely powerful political forces like we are today and like they are then. It's like this kind of belief and that like we actually can win, that a better world is possible. When you think about what we know about what ended up happening to them, when we know what they were up against, Jim Crow, literal like government agents and thugs who were killing people, and you see that kind of passion and belief and confidence that they had. I think there's a lot that we can kind of learn from that.
Through all of these examples, I mean, it's like you get so caught up in the force and the optimism and the like real like incredible organizing of these people through history, but at the same time, like you look at Texas now and it seems like power and money are even more concentrated. So like it's kind of, I mean, it's almost a history of like of losing in some ways, and I'm curious how you think of that.
Well, I'm a Texan, and one of the things that we love is people who went down fighting. I mean, you go through the Alamo. I mean, this is like central to our ideas that it's worth it to fight for what's right. And yet, like, yeah, we are up against it. There have been some really exciting developments in recent years, and one of the hopes with this book is to try to connect us to this tradition and to this movement that has existed before us, because I think we really are going to need to be thinking about what we're up against. I mean, I have 2 points here. Just to look at what's happened in the past few years, we've seen this explosion of progressive to even Democratic Socialist candidates winning in Texas. In my hometown of Austin, we have a DSA city council member. San Antonio has multiple DSA city council members. Right, there has been a lot of growth, particularly on the municipal level, of winning real victories for working class people and for socialist politics. On top of this, you've also seen this revival of a very spirited unionism in Texas. I don't know if you've seen this, and it happened after the book was published, but I've written about it for Jacobin. In Tarrant County, which is one of the reddest counties in the country, reddest urban counties in the country, Taylor Vermette, who was a union leader, ran for Texas Senate and won a seat that Trump won by a landslide. And he flipped it by doing this kind of working class politics, by talking about the things that everyday people are worried about, and talking about real solutions for them, and saying, hey, the culture war stuff has been set up to kind of divide us. So there's been a lot of opportunity and success, and I look at the history of the populists and I look at the history of the socialist movement, and I think that we are in that kind of prehistory. So you're thinking about the Farmers Alliance and some of these early organizations of working class people, when they're trying to figure out what is the vehicle that we can use, how do we need to organize, what kind of newspapers, media structures do we need. I think that's the moment that we're in right now, which is why I feel like this book has a lot of urgency, because we need to kind of learn some of those lessons where they went right and where they went wrong, so that we can channel a lot of this energy, because people really are looking for alternatives and for change, and it's our duty to find ways to deliver that for them.
We were talking about sort of class-rooted versus class-focused. I'm curious if you think, like, how can we kind of avoid because I think even like DSA can also become a kind of class-focused
For sure.
approach, and how is that something we can try to avoid?
First and foremost is finding ways to kind of organize our politics in and around unions. You know, one of the things that is interesting about even some of the major socialist organizers, when they were building some of these workers' organizations, they might help set it up, and then they would say, "Oh, I can't have membership because I don't work in this industry," or things like that. I think that is something that is really critical. It's like finding ways to participate, support, and build these kind of structures, but having this kind of confidence in your convictions. If you are a socialist, you believe that everyday people have the capacity to govern. And what our duty as organizers and as socialists is trying to build the vehicles and the organizations that working class people can kind of run so that they can win power both electorally and on the shop floor. And I think that really, not just for DSA, but any kind of radical, those are the things that we need to be asking ourselves. Where are these places where we can try to connect people and amplify their demands, help do the political education to kind of connect the forces and the individuals and the organizations that are harming you, by building those and kind of letting the class lead instead of radicals or individuals leading the class is definitely the way to go.
Are there any other radical movements that you would have liked to include in the book that you didn't get to?
I mean, for sure, the book ends for the most part with what happened with Emma Tenayuka. Obviously, in Texas, we see after this one of the most important democratic movements for dignity and humanity, which is the civil rights movement. There's been a lot of really tremendous organizing on that, on gay rights, on the fight for abortion rights in Texas, and I think these are all really, really critical. I wasn't able to kind of do that second half of the history, one, because of time, but two, because I really wanted to kind of coalesce around this one strand of kind of Texas radicalism that I think has been kind of less investigated.
Are you seeing any strands of that radicalism today in movements?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, like what we have seen, with this Taylor Ramette victory, it's a really fascinating moment because it reminds me of some of those early populist kind of prehistory of the populist movement, where you had radicals within the labor movement, the Knights of Labor, and within the Farmers Alliance, trying to figure out ways, how can we build this organization, which now has a lot of workers in it, a lot of farmers in it, into a political force? And they did multiple things. Some people try to run as reformists and progressives within the Democratic Party, until eventually they went out on their own and launched the People's Party. So when I see some of these movements, when I see this kind of encouragement for people wanting to do a different form of politics, I see us very much in the tradition of these kind of Texas radicals who are asking themselves this question that I open up the book with, which is, why is it that those who work most get least and those who work less get the most? And I think that people are asking themselves that question in Texas right now.
I'd love to hear about your own political path, and have you always been a populist? And yeah.
I mean, no. I mean, I grew up in a working class family, a fairly liberal one for sure. But I think, like many other teenagers, particularly boys in the South, I kind of gravitated toward the Republican Party, and I think probably for more trivial reasons, it wasn't something that I was doing in adulthood. But I came over to the left, and I came over really quickly. What happened to me was, once I started working, I started to have the experience of being taken advantage of by your boss, and I started thinking to myself, damn, unions make a lot more sense than the kind of arbitrary authority of some asshole with a bunch of money. So that for me, kind of like going through working, really ended up changing and shifting my perspective. I also kind of came up around like the Occupy movement, which I think many people in my generation did as well, and started to see these ideas of a different kind of politics than just liberalism. Obviously, through Bernie Sanders and through my work with the Michael Brooks Show and others, I was able to kind of really hone in onto like a democratic socialist politics that I hold today. And I don't think that like my story is actually that unique. I talk to a lot of people who have kind of similar backgrounds, and I think that being able to understand also how people kind of become Republicans are part of those political movements, is going to be really critical for winning places like Texas, where a lot of people have that kind of similar story.
Why do you think people become Republicans?
I mean, for me, I grew up poor in the South, and I looked around and I said, okay, well, what do the rich people believe? Well, the rich people are Republicans. I mean, it was very much a kind of idea. It's like, okay, this seems to be the thing that you need to do if you want to get ahead, kind of socially and politically. Now, that's maybe just me, being an ambitious young kid, but I think the Republican Party. It provides, for the rich, it provides tremendous benefits to them. So it's not surprising why they get victories there. I think for more working class people who are Republicans, I think it's important to understand that a lot of Republican politics is about grievance and anger, some of it justified and some of it unjustified. And I think that one of the big problems with the Democratic Party is that they cease to be the party of the working class. In Texas, things like the support for NAFTA were totally devastating to Texas's representation amongst working class people. And these things matter. I mean, polling shows that people do remember these kind of deals. The idea that the Democratic Party represented a kind of elite body. This isn't me trying to justify the Republican Party. It's trying to help people understand why it is that many people, when they look at the Democratic Party, they don't see their kind of saviors, because the Democratic Party has been very interested in fighting for working class people for a long time.
I think thinking of that element of grievance is partly why your book is also so helpful. There's been real fighting for the left and for collective, real power and anger, but really kind of driven anger.
Yeah, I mean, it ended up being something that was very successful in the way that they were able to channel it. I mean, one of my favorite parts of the book was the story of the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, which was one of the first interracial unions in the country. And these are black and white people working in extremely dangerous conditions in a time of just horrendous racism and Jim Crow. And what they were able to do by harnessing, yes, the solidarity and the nice things, but also the anger at the lumber bosses, was able to really build a kind of powerful political force. And I think that one of the things that I want people to kind of take from the book is remembering that we need to be able to have both, right? You have to be angry, you have to be really passionate, but you also really need to have kind of community and solidarity. There's a section of the story of the Brotherhood of Timber Workers where there's travelers kind of making their way through the piney woods, and they come across this very strange gathering for the South at the time, which was blacks and whites organizing around a barbecue and celebrating Juneteenth together. And I think as much as that chapter kind of focuses on the violence that came from the bosses trying to kill people in that movement, and the way that people try to organize to defend themselves against that violence, also understanding that kind of camaraderie and brotherhood and fellowship that was at that barbecue is also going to be really critical if we're going to be able to sustain ourselves for major fights ahead.
I loved your descriptions throughout the book of these barbecues and parties, basically, where this the social element is so important to feeling part of a community and and just having fun too.
I think so. I mean, these people read it in the book, but both the populists and the socialists did these things called encampments, and they were just these massive gatherings of people. And yeah, there was a political aspect to it. They would hear Eugene Debs speak and learn about socialism. They do literacy education, things like that too. But they're also just fun as hell. I mean, some of them were set up as basically carnivals. They'd have big brass bands and barbecues, and people would kind of spend a long time together in the summers in Texas, which was the slow period of time, particularly for people who were cotton farmers, and live in community with one another. And when it came time to stand up in those fights and to maybe look out for your neighbor when they were facing some of the terror that they ended up facing from the state, you had a real kind of brotherhood and fond memories and community of people. And I think we could really do with a lot more of that today, for sure.
I think it was also the Brotherhood of the Timber Workers that included women as members, which I thought was interesting because they weren't actually directly laboring in timber. This
was a fun thing, and for kind of labor history nerds, they might know the IWW, which was a really fascinating kind of organization. And yes, so with the timber workers, they do include women, and I would have to paraphrase it, but the kind of argument was, is like, if we go on strike and there's no food, like, your wife will be going hungry too, right? Like, they have just as much a stake, and yes, they gave them membership and voting rights, which was a very powerful and fascinating way of organizing people. It really shows, I think, the kind of large view that a lot of these kind of radicals were taking of working class life, because I mean that's a pretty advanced understanding of like social reproduction, to use fancy terms, but like understanding like these are members of the working class as well, and like this artificial division between the workplace and the home, if you want to do real radical organizing, you got to dispel that myth.
Yeah, there were some amazing quotes from the women who would also kind of would say like, if you're a real man, you'll go and join the union, which is also an interesting contrast now when like I think masculinity is so tied to individualism, but for them it was like,
No, I mean it is fun, and I'll tell you, maybe somebody who's a little enterprising could write probably a pretty good essay about like masculinity and these movements, because it's in there throughout, and it's interesting to see the ways it was both kind of used in that case. In positive ways and maybe sometimes in negative ways. But yes, this idea that basically, hey, if you don't join the union, I'm going to go find myself a real man who will. It is also interesting to see a lot of the appeals to like the manhood of people. I mean, there's a quote that I really like just because it's so fascinating. When the Mexican Revolution is happening in the socialist paper, The Rebel, there's this long section where there's this person basically chiding people who are racist against Mexicans, saying like, I believe the line is like, you suckers of the sunny South, and saying like, you guys are talking about revolution, doing things, and then these people who you call racial epithets and all these other things are like actually doing revolution, actually being real men. It is a very interesting kind of piece to look at.
Yeah, it was striking to me that it took a Mexican-American member of the Socialist Party, I think, who was the first person to say we need to translate all this material to actually spread it to the like Spanish-speaking workers. But
this is why, in many ways, I mean, it's tragic, obviously, because of what happens to these people in the Socialist Party, and then what is going to come in the coming decades. But one of the, I think, the real tragedies of the Texas Socialist Party is that, especially on like racial solidarity and including both Mexican and black workers within the movement, towards the end of the movement, before they just get shut down by the government, they were making these kind of strides, right, that seemed very promising. And you just would have to wonder, had they not been shut down by the government, had the paper not been shut down by the government, had being a socialist not effectively been made illegal in the state of Texas, what that next couple of decades could have looked like. I think there was a lot of promise.
When you were talking about the consolidation of land by these large landowners, I thought the process of dispossession was super interesting, how it involved kind of indebting local small landowners who would get into debt, and then because of that debt would have to sell their land. Can you talk about that debt as a...
Yeah, no, and I think that this is like a very critical part of the story, because we should be asking ourselves, where is this happening today? Because it certainly is. Basically what happens is you don't need to be a farmer to know that like at the beginning of the growing season, you're probably going to need a lot to buy a lot of things, and then hopefully you'll pay those off at the end of the season. In Texas, again, there was just a massive crisis of the cost of goods for most people. So what ends up happening is what's called the crop lien system, where you would go to the furnishing merchant and you would say, okay, I need to get these kind of materials for growing, but also my wife needs a dress, I want to get some pork fat, I need to get this or that. Basically everything that you needed, you had to go to these merchants. You don't have any cash. So the system was that the merchant basically had a hold on your end of year production. Every year you would see the same sight. If you were to go and appear at these furnishing merchants, people would walk in hat in hand. They would tally up the amount of cotton that they grew, and it would always never be enough. So year after year after year, you would start off more and more and more in debt. And then eventually, these merchants would say, oh, yeah, we'll buy the land from you. You can still live there, you can still work it, but we own it, and you have to pay a portion of your earnings from it. So this is how people literally became dispossessed on land that their family may have owned, that they might have been born on.
And then that they ended up working as tenants is a pretty... Yeah.
No, it was devastating, and I think it created a lot of grievance. And what's interesting about that moment is there is a difference between everybody who was growing was kind of stuck under this system, but there are obviously varying degrees, right? The people who had become tenant farmers on their own land, that's the worst end of the spectrum. And then there was people who maybe were able to make do, but they knew that they were kind of getting screwed over on price. So it ended up being a kind of a movement amongst farmers, people of like different kind of conditions economically. But yeah, I mean, it was something that ended up really changing the ownership and makeup of land in Texas. One thing, obviously, I want people to read this who care and are interested in fighting for working-class politics in Texas, but I think that this book really has lessons for us all. One, I think it's really important for us to be engaging with the radical history of this country. It's a rich history. I mean, when we first proposed this book, the idea was maybe to do a whole history of the South, but just focusing on Texas, realize, okay, well, this is a whole book in and of itself. So there's a lot out there. And the other thing that I think is one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book, and I picked the stories that I picked, was if you're on the left today, there are a bunch of questions about political parties. And that's like the number one thing that people like to debate. Should you run candidates within the Democratic Party? Should you run, start a socialist party? Should you start a party that maybe is kind of socialist, but you don't use words like socialism? Well, in Texas, you actually have examples of all three of these different kind of strategies. Looking at that, for people who are interested in trying to come up with political strategy for this country, you can look at what worked, what didn't, what was successful, what could have been done. I hope that people take one of my larger lessons from the book, which is that what vehicle it ends up taking is almost a secondary question, because what really mattered in Texas, what allowed this to happen, was the fact that working class people were organizing and understood themselves as members of a larger class. If you want to have the People's Party, you first have to kind of construct the people. And I hope more than anything that people can take that lesson very seriously.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
The myth of Red Texas, hot off the press. Thanks.
Thank you. That's so good.
Great.